The opening session of the afternoon is a discussion on India's neighbours looking east. We invite on stage Sandeep Unnithan, journalist and author, Commodore Srikant Kesnur, Commodore Srikant Kesnur, former Director, Maritime Warfare Center and Officer in Charge, Naval History Project, Deep Halder, journalist and author, and contributing moderator Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Senior Fellow, Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. We're keeping Abhijit here post-lunch so that nobody falls asleep. He'll keep us entertained.
Good afternoon. How are you doing? So if everybody, because I realize you're all very full and you all want to sleep, does everybody just want to get up and shake your hands and everything? No? You're fine? I don't hear you. Okay. You all look like one Christian missionary thing doing this. Very scary. But anyway, so I shall look east right now. At least to my east. So, look, we have, the topic is just very blandly, look east. So I'm going to make usual mischief and ask you to tell me when you look east, other than China, what do each of you see as one great opportunity and one great threat, other than China? Because everything look east gets bogged down in China. So Sandeep, starting with you.
Thanks, Abhijit. Firstly, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me here at the PLF. And Act East, well, I think a lot of our thinking when it comes to Act East is about China. You know, China is like the elephant in the room or the dragon in the room, if you can call it that. So other than China, a great opportunity for, you said a threat. A threat and an opportunity. The opportunity is easy. It's ASEAN, right? It's the 11 countries of ASEAN and the kind of great opportunity that we have for $100 billion worth of trade. The goal that's never been achieved until now, but I think there's firm intent now for the first time to make that happen in the next couple of years. Threat, I think the threat is more from our side rather than any other external factor, because I think for the longest time we have been first thinking east, then we've been winking east, then we've been looking east, and the one thing that we haven't been doing is acting east. So I think we should, the lethargy is on our part. We haven't kind of operationalized this entire look east, act east policy. We're not moving quickly enough on that. The road and the rail and the river port linkages with East Asia, some of the most important projects of our time have been languishing for the last 2 or 3 decades. And, you know, we keep hearing about it. I mean, I've been a journalist for almost 20, 25 years. I've been hearing about this, you know, Act East policy, Look East policy, and it's in some kind of slow lane that it moves like those boats on the Irrawaddy and on the Ganges, you know, slow pace, no urgency, 5,000 years civilization kind of thing. Whereas you have to see the Chinese, the speed at which they are moving. I mean, that is something that we should kind of be emulating. Much as I loathe the Chinese, there is immense learning to be had from the Chinese. The kind of leaps and bounds they've taken in technology and in acting. The Chinese, they actually build up the infrastructure first and then they conduct foreign policy. We conduct foreign policy, we talk about all the brilliant things that we're going to do, but nothing really happens on the ground. You know, because of, I guess, that civilizational lethargy of what is 20 or 30 years in a 5,000 year civilization.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks. I must confess to 2 things. One, great honor to be in a panel which has 2 of India's foremost strategic commentators in Sandeep and Abhijit, and I don't know Deep, but the loss is entirely mine. So, but wonderful honor to be here. And Abhijit, I must tell you something. Yesterday night, when I shared some photograph, you're such a rock star. They said, where is photograph with Abhijit? You know, and fortunately, we took one. We took one at the dinner table, and it's when I put out that they said, oh, well, you're in good company. You know? So your question, opportunity and threat. It's easy to say, be tempted to look at opportunities in terms of, say, the new grouping, the Quad, for example, or something. But what I'll do is take actually a deeper look, going from the previous sessions where you're a moderator, and you discussed hard power and soft power. And of course, you made the good point, though you use the bashed wife syndrome. The essential point was that soft power without hard power is flaccid. And you need a combination of the two. And I think where India today is at this juncture, where it can very intelligently use hard power and soft power in relation to looking east, in relation to all the geographies, but particularly in relation to looking east. And if I can elaborate on for 30 seconds more, we are sitting in Pondicherry, and I think history gives us this great example of connectivity with what we call the Indo-Pacific today, stretching right up to Japan and the east coast of Africa. There was a vibrant, thriving connectivity, which brought in lots of elements of soft power. But as you also brought out, there was hard power there. So I think if you look back into history and march forward, that today we could use the Indian military, security, soft power, the diplomacy, all together to tango well, can be a game changer as far as India's look east is concerned. The threat is inherent in itself, as Sandeep says. Our problem is lack of coordination in getting this together, in too much romanticizing about certain soft power aspects. And what is that famous song in Shalimar, you know, 1, 2, cha cha cha, ek kadam aage, cha cha cha, do kadam piche, cha cha cha. Our problem is kabhi do kadam aage, ek kadam piche, kabhi ek kadam aage, do kadam piche. So Mr. Naidu, Girmat Jana is the threat.
As a fellow Bengal, you know what I'm going to say. So it's like, the Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive. So Bangladesh is both an opportunity and a threat. Opportunity because, strategic neighbor, and, the two governments are in the good books of each other. A lot of talks happen between Modi and Hasina. And there's people-to-people contact, the sharing of culture between West Bengal and Bangladesh. Our cinema, our language, our food habits are the same. So this is a great opportunity to build stronger ties with Bangladesh. Strategically, I think India is well off having Bangladesh by our side, but you know that China has also made inroads. So I think India should constantly keep looking at Bangladesh, because I think that's the only ally we have left, who's by your side. Threat because post Hasina, if you ask me, I personally see a future which in Bangladesh which makes me feel very afraid, because I think there can be a time not too far away from now when the Jamaat comes to power, not the BNP. BNP is all but over, because Tariq is in London, Zia is under house arrest, Khalida Zia. But I think there might be, looking at the Bangladeshi society as I have been for the past 2 years because of the book I'm writing, I think post Hasina to hold Bangladesh together socially and politically will be a big threat for Bangladesh and thereby for India. In terms of the terror that will be exported, there is anyway a very porous border that we share with Bangladesh. In terms of our strategic ties, I think it will be very difficult if we let this opportunity that we have now turn into something else.
But just to piggyback onto that Bangladesh question, we were complicit in allowing Sheikh Hasina to turn Bangladesh into a de facto one-party state, right? I mean, when she was going after Khalida Zia, which suited us perfectly because we hated Khalida Zia, we kind of maybe lost the larger goal that we need an alternative which is sometimes anti-India to allow the people to vent their frustration. Because, you know, one of the principles of foreign policy, this was this famous president of Mexico called Benito Juarez. And he always used to say that Mexico's great tragedy was it was so close to America and so far from God. So all these small countries tend to have this sort of rather unfortunate view of their bigger neighbor. How much of it do you think was poor vision on our part that we didn't lean or at least persuade Sheikh Hasina to have some kind of a relatively not rabid opposition? That today the only opposition is the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is sort of, they're essentially remnants of people who supported the Pakistan army.
Yeah, absolutely. The 2001 example, if you remember, Abhijit, when BNP came to power, and what happened after, the current president of Bangladesh I got to meet, Mohammad Chuppu. He was he was a former judge, and I got to interview him. He was then the acting president, the president to be. And he said that, you know, in a single night, within the span of a single night, when the BNP came to power, hundreds of Hindu women were raped. So I think, it's violence so gruesome that whatever we are seeing now in Bangladesh during Sheikh Hasina's time, you know, the 2021 Durga Puja violence that happened from Comilla to and spread elsewhere, I think seems far less than what was and what can be. But yes, I mean, did we make a mistake allowing Sheikh Hasina to turn Bangladesh in a one-party state? Probably yes, but I don't know what our alternative could have been. So that's also a bigger question, you know, this, who is there to take that space sort of nationally? There are lots of parties in Bangladesh. There are also communist parties. But nationally to take on Mujib's daughter, when Khalida Zia is almost your sworn enemy, she's in your face anti-India. So how do you, even there, so, you know, there are, I'm sure you know this, there are some Hindu leaders in BNP. And some of them are anti-India. I don't know what they feel from the heart, but at least in their politics, they say that they're, for maybe greater acceptance within Bangladesh, they say that they're anti-India. So I seriously don't know what options India had. But I think, since you asked me, I think one thing this government could have done now is perhaps hold her accountable more in terms of how her government treats minorities. You know, on the face of it, it's a secular government, quote unquote, and all of that. But when the attacks take place, so I think it's like a you don't look at me, I don't look at you kind of situation. So there's a Nupur Sharma episode. So Sheikh Hasina does not say anything. Attacks on Hindus take place in 2021. Modi government doesn't say anything. It's only civil society that speaks up. Journalists write about it, and that's where it ends.
Sandeep, since you brought up ASEAN, do you want to walk us through, because even within ASEAN, there's a lot of dangers. So, for example, Laos essentially acts like a Chinese stooge within ASEAN. Cambodia, for the longest time, was acting as a Chinese stooge. There have been a lot of complaints that, on one hand, you know, we tend to we've almost outsourced our Southeast Asia policy to Singapore. You don't have to agree with that, but that's one school of thought. And on the other, Singapore itself was kind of playing footsie with China. We didn't know which side of the ball it was going to come down under. So I want you to unpack your sort of analysis when you said ASEAN is an opportunity. Let's now bring China in there. And why don't you talk us through what you see as the fissures that prevent us from expanding on the opportunity that is ASEAN?
Thanks, Abhijit. You know, and when you mentioned ASEAN and Act East, I was just reminded of what I saw in the parliament. We just had a new parliament in May this year. And two things that really struck me, the space behind the speaker's wall. The space behind the speaker on the wall, you have the two big symbols over there. One is the Dharma Chakra of the Ashokan Empire, and the other was the Sengol, which the Prime Minister installed over there from the Chola Empire. It's very interesting how these are two symbols of two of the greatest empires that have, ruled India. Almost, they had their peaks about 1,000 years apart, but the Mauryan Empire was essentially a continental empire which straddled the Silk Route for almost 1,000 years, right? It traded with Greece, it traded with China, essentially landward trade. The Chola Empire, which at its zenith in the 13th century or so, was a thalassocratic empire, which means a maritime empire. Very few empires of the kind we've had in India before. And they ruled all the way they controlled all of South India and all the way up to Kedah, Malaysia, and they traded with, the Champa kingdom in southern Vietnam and onwards to China. So essentially what we should be looking at is a combination of these two empires. The one that dominates the landward trade, the Silk Route, and the other one that dominates the maritime Silk Route. So I think for the first time we are seeing those pieces falling in place because, we didn't have this kind of economic muscle that we now have with the kind of projections in growth in the next 20, 25 years that we will, if we grow at 7%, we are going to be about 20 billion GDP in the next 20, 25 years, right? The third largest economy. So with all this, we will be in a very good position to reimagine the place that was once enjoyed by these two empires, this landward and the seaward empire. And it was only done by a third empire, that was the British Empire, which did this in the 19th century and in the 20th century, early 20th century. They converted the Indian Ocean into what they called a British lake, right? They completely controlled all access points into the Indian Ocean. They controlled all the maritime frontiers, all the landward threats that came towards India. They basically created firewalls from Afghanistan on one side, Tibet on the other side. They prevented these two great empires, the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire, from coming towards India. They protected India from all around, from land and from sea. And this was the one empire that kind of embodied the land and the seaward things of these two great Indian empires. It's a very long preamble, but essentially we are now in the phase of reimagining what the British Empire once was. So while decolonization and all that is fine, that one aspect that I want us to retain while being a democracy is that aspect of empires and how they imagine frontiers and how they imagine relations with other countries and all that. And I think ASEAN is going to be one big challenge, like you mentioned. There are huge fissures, and we are actually, we are beginners in this whole thing. We've been there for 1,000 years, and then we've taken a holiday for about 1,000 years, and now we are entering the game where China is everywhere. All the countries that you've mentioned, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam, not so much, but Cambodia and Laos, the smaller, weaker countries, completely dominated by the Chinese. Even the Singaporeans, I mean, they are, look, the Singaporeans, if we talk to them, they say, look, we are very close to the US, but we know that the Chinese are there as well. We don't want to antagonize them and all that. So there is always that thing of these small countries, by virtue of their size and geographical location, have turned this thing of balancing larger countries into an art. Exactly like Deep, you mentioned, Bangladesh does it. Sri Lanka used to do it pretty well until some point. So, I mean, there's a fine balance that these countries have been doing, and it's for us to engage them more actively through economic links. We need to build up all those trade routes, these rail and road links that we've been talking of for decades, and then actually present ourselves as an alternative to China, and without being actually on the ground, investing in projects and creating deep relationships of the kind that we did 1,000 years back during the Chola Empire, where we had the Srivijaya Empire, you had Angkor Wat and all that being created purely on the backs of Indian soft power, backed by hard power. And that is something that we need to do. And the big question here is, I know Commodore Srikant would be a little wary about this, is that, talking about this, is that our entire maritime, focus ends at the Malacca Straits. Once we cross the Malacca Straits, we become diplomats. oh, we have to be very nice and we have to be, we have to respect the rules of the road. We're very reluctant about projecting power into the South China Sea or beyond. So it's, when we come to that China question, I think sections of the military become diplomats. And so that is one question that we should address, that till the time you don't kind of forward deploy, you become a force to reckon with, and you enter the Chinese backyard exactly the way the Chinese have done over the last decade. They have been surging ships and submarines into our backyard, patrolling in areas which, to my mind, you should never allow an adversary to enter even. The Bay of Bengal, for instance, the Andaman Sea, these are strategic oceans for us, for the reasons of the second strike and deterrent and all of that. Till the time we don't enter the South China Sea and present a threat to the Chinese, that our hard power thing is not going to be actioned. So, it's a very long answer to what you just mentioned.
No, it gave me a lot of points to segue onto you, Commodore, because you brought up this thing of, how one step forward and then two steps back. And Sandeep was talking about, the getting involved in projects. Now, what I want to pick your head on is two things. One is, how do we engage in projects in Southeast Asia which will mostly be profitable? Because it seems to me that China has never engaged in a profitable project in Southeast Asia. Whatever they invest in goes bankrupt one way or another. Be it Gwadar, which never took off, or Hambantota, which is not making any money. To date, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a cost-benefit analysis or an opportunity cost analysis of a single One Belt, One Road, BRI, whatever it's called right now, project.
Conversely, Abhijit, might have just been a thing of trapping all those countries. It must have
absolutely putting them into a debt trap. So the thing is, we don't have that kind of money. So question number one, how do we engage without playing this sort of, jealous lover game? Because like Sandeep brought out, they're doing this balancing. They basically want us to keep throwing money at them and play, jealous lover or whatever with no benefit to us. So, A, how do we play that game, number one? Number two, again, taking on from what you said and Sandeep elucidated on, America had two frontiers with the USSR. One was the direct frontier, which was the Barents Sea, which was almost always quiet. There was hardly ever any activity at Elmendorf Air Base. There was never any alarms or whatever. Everything used to happen on German soil, on the Fulda Gap. So why is it that we keep focusing on our border with China instead of creating trouble in the South China Sea where we should be diverting their resources? How do we change that culture?
Some part I wish the question you had asked to Sandeep, you had asked me to unpack our relations with ASEAN and asked him this question. But 2-3 quick points and then we'll see if I can elaborate a little. First is, obviously the short answer, don't play the jealous lover. Jealous lovers, usually the fate at the end is quite tragic. So we mustn't get into that trap. But look, there are 3 or 4 issues here, and I'll take on what Sandeep brought out. You must, when you talk of realistic in foreign policy, a little bit of that realism must begin with internal realism of what you're capable of doing and what you're not capable of doing, and what is the extent of your resources. You got to cut the coat to the cloth that you have. You're talking of China, which is 5 times, your economy. Their naval budget is probably more than our defense budget. Even in ASEAN, for us to pretend to be the most significant power there is a bit of illusion, because I think ballpark our trade figures with ASEAN is somewhere like $70-80 billion, while China alone has more than $500 billion trade there. So what are the opportunities and threats with regard to ASEAN? I think 2 or 3 very quickly. One is, having said all this, we're not fighting with any ASEAN country. There are no disputes, including maritime and border disputes, with any ASEAN country. The second is, now that Myanmar is a part of ASEAN, there is a geographical contiguity that you are getting. And therefore, third, can you, on the basis of not having direct fights and yet now having a geographical boundary, invest more in ASEAN and South China Sea? I think the answer is yes. And if you will see, look, our foreign policy statements, given that our engagement with ASEAN itself from early 90s till now has been slow, our foreign policy statements in the last 10 years have been remarkable for how much bolder they're getting. They're not naming China, but from what I think what Prime Minister Modi said in Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, various places, what the foreign minister says, we are clearly telling them that, look, this can't be business as usual. Now, can we invest more in projects there, particularly the kind that China is? I'm not too sure. We got energy projects. We could do much more there. Can we help some countries? I think on the military vector we are doing, the BrahMos missiles with Philippines, recently giving a ship to Vietnam. So I think these are some of the things. And we have gotten slightly better relations there with people. I mean, you brought out what was the state of distress before. I think we have moved ahead on all of them, including with Myanmar too. But will countries in this region not play footsie with China? They will continue to. They are going to be, everyone is going to be like classic partners in a coalition government. They're going to extract their pound of flesh, and between one alliance and other, they're going to choose. So I think that whether Singapore is playing footsie with us or with that, you got to take it for granted. So we up our game, do things better, do things good that we are better at, but getting into a kind of competition with China might make us, like you brought in the USSR, USA analogy. I think what USSR did wrong was to compete with US and go bankrupt. We should not do that.
Deep. I'm going to take on from there, because there are two countries in the East which are notorious for playing footsie with China, at least that are of direct concern to us. One is Burma and one is Bangladesh. On one hand, I've noticed our foreign policy framers seem to have a great deal of confidence in the way Burma plays China. That, they're able to sign a lot of projects with them. Then suddenly one night, they'll kick the Chinese out of all the projects and ask them to leave everything in the north. I don't think any countries managed to play China that well other than maybe North Korea, right? On the other hand, we see a lot of question marks raised about Bangladesh's ability to play the same game. Can you kind of even this out for us? Because it's quite strange that Rohingyas aren't even our problem, and yet they end up becoming a problem between India and Bangladesh. But even though they're a problem between India and Myanmar, it doesn't actually ever become a diplomatic problem between Myanmar and India. So how do you, given your previous answer on our compulsions and our lack of options within Bangladesh, how are we going to play this game between Burma, Bangladesh, and India?
Specifically on the question of how you deal with Bangladesh, I think it's how you manage between your Jaishankar and your Amit Shah. Okay, so I think, look, I spoke to somebody in Army League who might possibly become the next foreign minister of Bangladesh, and she is quote unquote secular and sort of pro-India, and aware of the fact that the birth of Bangladesh happened because of India's help. Huh? No, someone else. So, but when I asked her, what do you think of India? So she said that when I look up, what do I see? I see this huge landmass of Hindus, right? So that sense is always there in our mind. So imagine for your domestic politics, when you say things like parasites for people who are coming in, that affects their domestic politics, right? And thereby they have to take steps to balance it. So I think yet you have your domestic politics, which is a reality. You have to win elections in certain states, border states. These are very emotive issues. But I think it's a very thin line you tread in terms of how you manage expectations in Bangladesh vis-a-vis China. I think Bangladesh also uses China to, like you said, to balance India. And this Shopner Podda Setu, which is a technological marvel, this sort of this bridge over the river. It's China, right? You can't even enter that game, and China is not looking at getting its money back, right? But China is looking at getting a very strong foothold into Bangladesh. But specifically on the issue of Bangladesh, you have something Chinese don't. Chinese don't speak Bangla. Chinese don't share your same culture. So if you sort of balance how you tackle the issue, at least the language you use, or sort of the virtues you make when on some very contentious issues, so that they do not become diplomatic problems between the two countries. I think that's the way to go. To take the lover analogy, that to sort of how do you balance a jealous lover? You become a sensitive lover.
But just to interject there, one of the complaints I keep getting in Dhaka is that Delhi keeps appointing Bengali Brahmin ambassadors to Dhaka, who then treat it like Mayer Badi. Maike, not Ghar Jamai ki tarah, whatever, right? And they kind of think that they know better than them. How do you deal with that situation?
It's a very tricky question, because I think that was a problem. So which is why they are now sending sort of non-Bengalis as diplomats to Bangladesh very recently. Okay, and I think one of the things that have happened, this is a very specific issue, sort of I can't broad base it really, but I think one of the issues that happened is a particular gentleman, I'm not going to take his name, he has been talking only to the Bangladeshi Hindus and not so much to the Bangladeshi Muslims. Now that can't be something you do in Dhaka, because you have to talk to all kinds of people, right? So to balance the sort of Mamarwadi thing, if you also send someone who doesn't understand how tricky this balance is, then that also becomes another problem. And this is a very current issue. He's been denying visas to people who are close to Awami League, who in fact some of them work for Indian media houses as Bangladeshi correspondents, so medical visas, etc. So I think being that hard on sort of to balance the Mamarwadi effect is also not a prudent thing to do. So I think I think you have to trade very cautiously, month to month, issue to issue on Bangladesh. But I definitely think one of the things you can trade, you have to be, I think Sheikh Hasina's government needs to be told off. Is every attack on Hindu minority, which is a reality. I think that's the sort of the secularism of Dhaka, whatever remains of it, can't answer for what happens in the backyard of Bangladesh.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back to that because there's a military angle to that as well. But Sandeep, I'm going to push you all the way far, far, far east, specifically North Korea. Because, one of the things that's happened with Chinese proliferation is they don't do it directly anymore. They kind of outsourced it to North Korea in a sense, where the Chinese aren't the ones transferring the designs and the reactors. They've almost outsourced it to North Korea, saying, this is a fantastic scheme for you to be earning some dollars on the side. Please go ahead and proliferate as much as you want. A lot of Pakistani missiles was joint development between North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. There was a huge, even for nuclear warheads, there was a very significant, design overlap in the warheads and things like that, where it was joint development, but technology transfer from Beijing. Now, one of the things you brought up was the Commodore brought up was our collaboration with, say, Japan and Korea, which are the primary antagonists of somebody like North Korea. Now, talk me through what our thinking is, or what the deficiencies in thinking are, in how we balance this relationship. Because we've traditionally had fairly decent ties with North Korea, and yet at the same time, they have given Pakistan a lot of stuff that they probably shouldn't have. And the more we engage with South Korea and Japan to contain China, the more we sort of risk much, much more unpredictable behavior on North Korea's part, which is much more risk accepting and rule violating than China. Just play this out for me.
Well, Abhijit, very interesting what you just mentioned. What the Chinese did essentially was starting from the 60s and the 70s was they had these two countries that they used to firewall. On the one side, in East Asia, they firewalled Japan and South Korea with North Korea. And in South Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, they used Pakistan to firewall India. So for the longest time, we've been fighting this battle with Pakistan, little realizing that those blueprints actually came from China for the bomb, right? 1983 was a turning point in the geopolitics of South Asia, is because that's when Pakistan's nuclear enrichment capability reached to a point when they could kind of make the bomb. And they had those Chinese tested devices. The Chinese had tested devices for them in 83, 84. It was a 1966 design which they transferred to them, a 20 KT weapon. So it's probably the only time in the history of the world where one country has actually transferred complete atomic weapon blueprints, know-how, the way to build it. And of course, they asked the North Koreans to supply the Nudong missiles to arm their as carriers for their nuclear weapons. So it's a very interesting triangle of these three countries, China, North Korea, and Pakistan. So, I mean, North Korea is actually on the side of the enemies, is sleeping with the enemy. So I don't see us collaborating with them in any way, in any meaningful way. I'm aware of sometime in the 1990s when the North Koreans were going through a very serious drought, and they'd approached us with offers of transferring missile technology, the one that they sold to the Pakistanis. They said, you give us grain, we'll give you missile technology. And it's remarkable how they managed to do all that they do with the kind of budgets that they have to launch ICBMs and launch, strategic missiles, nuclear weapon carrying missiles with, 1950s technology and all that, which means they're totally invested in this game. They are a security state after all, a bit like Pakistan. But for us to kind of engage with North Korea, I'm a little skeptical, because as far as East Asia goes, we are in the Japan, South Korea, United States camp. And a lot of our technology is now coming from South Korea. And the prime example of that is what we have facing the Chinese in Ladakh, which is the K9 howitzer. K9 howitzer is actually a South Korean howitzer that was developed to fight the North Koreans. And it so happened that it was a howitzer that was developed for high altitudes, which they said that we're going to give it to the Indian Army to deploy in the deserts and in plains. And then finally they discovered that the actual place that it needs to be deployed, and it finally was in Ladakh. So it was a happenstance of sorts. But the fact is that there is far more than we can learn from the South Korean defense model and the Japanese defense model than we can from the North Korean defense model. I mean, if you're looking at collaboration, I would want the North Korean spirit, right, with the North Korean and the Iranian spirit. It's amazing. We should hand our entire defense procurement to the North Koreans and Iranians. I keep joking about that. Because of the ability to look at Iran, right? Look at Iran. They are under every possible sanction in the world. But they are exporting drones to the Russian Federation to fight in Ukraine. That's how good they are, because they figured out there's no country in the world that's going to sell them fighter jets, right? So they jumped onto this opportunity provided by combat drones, kamikaze drones. They've weaponized it, and today they are world leaders in that. The North Koreans have moved ahead they're supplying ammunition to the Russians now, post that thing. So I want the spirit of the North Koreans and the Iranians, but with the technology of the South Koreans and the Japanese. Now, I mean, this is something that we've always done, East and West. I mean, Srikant's friends in the Navy have done a beautiful job of combining the East and the West. And finally, you don't have either capabilities of the West or of the East. Your ships are like, gold-plated gunboats. I call many of them. But some of the early ones, Srikant. But
that's so unfair. But it is true, because one of the things I keep hearing about, with Western commentators, Commodore, is, India pretends that it's being strategically ambiguous, when in fact it's strategically schizophrenic. Now, strategic ambiguity is wonderful because the other chap doesn't know which side you're on. But strategic schizophrenia, when you yourself don't know which side you're on, is very, very problematic. And one of the ways this comes in is because Iran on one hand and South Korea on the other have absolutely no ambiguity in their mind on which side they're on. In India, we still have this thing, oh, do we really want Russian this or do we want Western quality? Do we want Eastern style, lots of quantity, or do we want Western style, lots of quality? And this becomes a very debilitating conversation to have because we still don't have political direction to the military. Ki, boss, this is the side you come down on. I've taken an executive decision. Now you guys execute. Number one. Number two, this sort of schizophrenia almost seems to pervade naval thinking for me as well. Because, the point Sandeep made was that you have to, and you made this in passing. What is our naval strategy exactly? Is it sea denial? How do you combat China's wealth? Either do you go in for something asymmetric like sea denial, mostly submarines, where you go deep inside the South China Sea and cause, or at least threaten to cause havoc without causing havoc there? Or do we match them aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier and sea control, which we won't, that's not a game that we can win. And there's negatives to both because Germany opted for submarines and look how badly it screwed them over. On the other hand, the USSR opted for, the Gorshkov strategy of building lots of aircraft carriers just like the Americans, and look where that got. So which side are we going? Admiral Donitz or Admiral Gorshkov?
Neither. Admiral Rajendra Chola. No. Look, again, these sort of questions that the thing about Abhijit, you and Sandeep, because you have the good of the country and the Indian Navy at heart, you are hard people to please, So you have the kind of higher standards and they must be there. But let's, wo bolte na, theek lagao yaar, So let's now unpack few of these things. One, Sandeep's earlier assertion that Indian Navy is not there in beyond the Malacca, wrong. I think we just finished a Malabar exercise of Australia. Before that, the Delhi, my old ship, a Shivalik class, was there in the South China Sea going all the way to Japan. We sent the Kiltan to Vietnam. A submarine just went to Australia. Over the years, the amount of ships that we are sending into South China Sea with longer legs, deeper legs, greater staying power, P8I aircraft have been positioned there.
Bases.
So I think basis goes beyond the Navy. Is I think fairly huge. It's humongous, and we are okay with letting people think that we are not quite there, but that's not quite true. So there is significant, considerable presence. And mind you, I must tell you a very brief historical anecdote. When our first ship visit to China, the old INS Mysore went to China in the late 50s. After giving a red carpet welcome, the Chinese, once the ship left and they tried to subvert the sailors' communism, once the ship left for Japan, Chinese lodged an official protest about Indian ship transgressing their waters. So the schizophrenia was evident there, But to come back, let's answer other aspects of your question. Is there schizophrenia in the way we have dealt with strategic ambiguity? No. Possibly you have a valid point there in suggesting. I would look at it as lack of coordination in the higher bureaucratic apex, political apex. So there was a bit of mismatch in thinking of various people, which translated to not knowing what you're doing on ground. Having said that, and without making it very political, I believe many of these things have been resolved in the last few years. There's a much tighter control. The External Affairs Minister, speaking at the Jasjit Singh Memorial Lecture, when he was not the External Affairs Minister, not the Foreign Secretary, made a very important statement. He says the foreign policy of a country like India must be securitized. It must have security as its great element. Our diplomats should know security issues and defense guys should know strategic issues. So I think we're getting better there, and all these issues of theaterization, CDS, having single point military advice are to remove strategic ambiguity or strategic schizophrenia, whichever way you put it. Your last point, Look, I think Donetsk, and I don't think Goroshko also, though they built aircraft carriers, ultimately their strategy was of sea denial and not of sea control vis-a-vis America. I think any country that looks at sea denial as its overarching strategy is bound to fail. If China follows A2AD as its only strategy against the Americans, it's pragmatic, but it's not going to make them a superpower. I think as far as we are concerned with China, we must play both games. It's not either or, it is and. I must look at significant amount of sea denial, including submarines. I must look at aircraft, both from the aircraft carriers and islands, because there might be vital sea areas in different parts of the world where some places you need sea denial and some places you need sea control. So it's not a zero-sum game as far as I know.
Fair point. We only have about 10 minutes left now, so I'm going to throw it open to questions. Please be specific who you want to ask the question to, and only questions, please. No comments. Let's start from here. The gentleman in blue, and then the gentleman in the big, from Odisha, in the big blue striped shirt.
My question to Admiral Commodore sir. The question is. Sorry. The question is, I have seen in many times whenever the new Navy chief comes and the thought process of having third aircraft carrier significantly changes. And at one point of time, the late CDS said ki we need not have third aircraft carrier, and Navy said ki we want it. So actually what is going to happen and rationale behind that?
No, I don't think, yes, the CDS mentioned, and I think it was more a look at what he thought were the priorities that ought to have been at that point of time. The Navy was very clear that it was not in agreement, and I think to a large extent this churn is required. It is higher defense management. The country has to decide as a whole. The Navy is quite clear about what it wants. The CDS made his point, but I think there was nothing definite that sort of came out of it. 30 seconds, one point that I wanted to address. You know, he talked of the spirit of Iran and North Korea, and of course we must take that. But, you know, the people there, I'm sure Sandeep meant that as a kind of just a push. But the people there suffer much more. We have to be careful when we want to take that model. Having said that, let us remember we've also been through sanctions. We've been through sanctions after 98. We've been through sanctions which affected our space program. We've been through sanctions which affected our supercomputer program. You are aware of how the Sea Kings and a whole lot of things got affected. I think we've ridden that crest. So you must, as very erudite people, you must be demanding, but also be a little generous.
So my question is regarding the research ship that came from China to Sri Lanka, and we have Maldives in the Indian Ocean. That there is a election coming up, and there is a chance that the opposition might win. How does that play for India and China? And that we have started the new base in Andaman Nicobar, looking on the Strait of Malacca. How does that opportunity, vis-a-vis against China?
Three questions in all. One, how does the election result in the Maldives affect us? Second is the base in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And the third was the research ship visiting Sri Lanka. Do you all three want to sort of chime in? I'm the moderator. I'm not the
Look, very quickly, as far as Maldives is concerned, I think there's going to be a runoff. So let's wait for it. Obviously, what happens politically will have some impact or other, and that's for our political people to cover the bases there. But let me answer in a larger sense, and this goes back to what Abhijit asked. What can we do where there is intense competition? And I brought this out yesterday. China is competing with us in Maldives, both for influence and to have something right there under your nose. So we stationed, as I gave example, we stationed just one Dornier aircraft and 2 helicopters just 2 years ago. And this small unit in 2 years has done saving of lives and casualty evacuation and medical evacuation of close to 500 people, and has done some 450 sorties there. So it's intense, it is deep, and if you establish those sort of professional linkages, I think you will get goodwill. It will be difficult to push you out, because I don't think the Chinese can get in lots of money. They may not be able to get this kind of professional effort. As regards their research ship coming to Colombo, you can't prevent any ship from coming anywhere. Again, our diplomats and politicians will work from the back to have carrots and sticks. But oceans are open. You can't prevent anyone coming there. But you can ensure that you keep a good, strong watch on it. And I think you must be assured that we are doing that. The more interesting thing is the project in Nicobar. And this is where we have, I think, gotten better with ASEAN. 2 decades ago, anything that you did in Andaman and Nicobar, all of ASEAN countries would rise up with concern about Indian Navy's ambitions, what you're doing. It tells you how we have increased and bettered our relationship, that there is today, when we're building a huge infra port in Car Nicobar, there's nothing of that sort.
Absolutely. In case you didn't know, Sukarno used to hate India for, he claimed Car Nicobar. Indonesia actually had a claim over the Nicobar Islands, which nobody wants to talk about. That's why he sent the submarines during the 65 war to Pakistan.
They sent submarines and missile boats. After the war.
Thankfully. Sandeep, Deep, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've covered it.
Next round of questions. Behind the gentleman in white.
Abhijit, you have 4 minutes.
I'm Lakshay. The title says Looking East. When do we act east? I mean, how can we strengthen our socio-cultural ties with the eastern neighbors?
Socio-cultural ties. Any more questions? Because I'm going to club them all together. The gentleman in the check shirt.
Hello, I'm Sambit. My question is to Deep. So, while Bangladeshi, the plight of the Hindus in Bangladesh, and while the Bangladeshi immigration is, the illegal immigration is coming into India, and all this happening, and what should be the strategy from the Indian politicians to strike out a balance when to stop the illegal migration, and at the same time asking them to stop whatever the happening with the Hindus, and then also making friends with them to have a leverage over China. How can we do that?
Yeah. So how do we balance preventing refugees from coming in, at the same time telling them to stop killing Hindus? Basically, that was the gist of the question. And the second question was socio-cultural ties with Southeast Asia. Do you want to go with that?
I don't think I can have an answer to that. How do you balance this two? But I know it's a very tough balance. Mike. It's just go. Yeah, I don't. Seriously, I don't have an answer to this. But I think I can only say it's easier to sit here and sort of opine, but it's a very, very tough balance. And I think specifically on the question of Bangladesh, I think the government is doing a pretty fine job. It needs to keep doing it. It needs to keep engaging more with Bangladesh, people-to-people contacts. There's something called the Silchar Silet sort of festival, which happened in our side, Silchar, and it's going to happen in Silet in October, first week of October. Those things help. Their businessmen come down here. Our businessmen go there. There's a little cultural thing that happens. Some ministers I was there at the Silchar edition of the festival, and you had some Indian ministers. You have the Bangladeshi foreign minister come there. You had flew down artists from Kolkata to Silchar. I think these things help. But I personally feel that I think India should talk more to Bangladesh about the other thing you mentioned, which is attack on minority Hindus. I think the Home Minister Asaduzzaman Khan came last year in Delhi to meet Mr. Amit Shah. What happened in the meeting, the press was not told. But apparently, Mr. Shah did bring this up. So I think it should be brought up from time to time. It should be reported in Indian press. Yeah, that's it. But I think the strategy is more or less on point.
Anand Ranganathan's 30 seconds. Okay. Right. Look, 2-3 things. Movement Look East became Act East. It meant greater emphasis from Look East itself was movement from socio-cultural to economic and trade, and Act East brought in connectivity and security element. So I take your point, but as a bit of a security conservative, I think we have done enough of socio-cultural. What they are looking for and we are looking for is more decisive things on ground, which comes through connectivity, security, infrastructure and trade. So socio-cultural has been done enough as far as ASEAN is concerned. Very, very quick, last 15 seconds. Permit me to be a maritime evangelist. I think in some ways, best way to do socio-cultural is to keep sending Navy ships more often. They are the most palpable physical manifestations of Look East. And apart from showcasing your technology, they can also showcase soft power, be a vector for soft power, including good food. Thank you.
Thank you. So guys, I hope we didn't put you to sleep. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed yourself. I think I've done my job of keeping you all awake. Yes? Thank you.